The blood-red sunset painted the open Wyoming sky as Ethan Cole reined in his horse at the edge of the creek. Exhaustion tugged at his bones. 5 days of hard riding from Colorado territory with little rest. Knight's Ferry, little more than a collection of wooden buildings clinging to existence in the unforgiving landscape of 1874, shimmered like a mirage in the distance. He'd heard there was work to be found. A cattle operation looking for experienced hands. At 32, Ethan had been a drifter long enough to know the patterns of the West, when to move on, when to put down temporary roots. He dismounted his dun gelding, allowing the horse to drink while he stretched his trail-weary muscles. That's when he heard it, a voice that seemed to float across the water, clear as crystal and sweet as summer rain. The melody was unfamiliar, something haunting and beautiful that made him stop and listen with every fiber of his being. Curious, Ethan moved quietly along the riverbank, following the sound until he spotted her. On a flat boulder that jutted into the rushing water sat a young woman with honey-brown hair that caught the dying light. Her simple calico dress was hiked slightly to keep the hem from getting wet, revealing modest ankles dipped in the cool water. She seemed unaware of his presence, completely lost in her song. Ethan stood transfixed, feeling something shift inside him. In all his years of wandering, all the towns and territories he'd passed through, nothing had ever struck him quite like this. The emptiness he'd carried for so long suddenly had a name, a shape, a feeling of possibility. The woman's song came to an end, and she turned as if sensing his presence. Their eyes met across the distance, hers a startling blue against her sun-kissed skin. For a moment, neither moved. "I didn't mean to intrude," Ethan called, removing his hat. "That was beautiful singing, madam." A flush crept across her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "Thank you, sir. Though I don't usually have an audience out here." "Ethan Cole," he said, stepping closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "Just arrived in these parts." "Beatrice Vaughn," she replied, "though most folks call me Bea." She studied him openly, her gaze taking in his trail-worn appearance. "If you're headed to Knight's Ferry, you've still got a mile to go before sundown." "I reckon I'll make it," Ethan said, smiling slightly. "Is there a decent place to stay in town?" "Mrs. Holloway runs a boarding house on Main Street. It's clean and her cooking is fair." He gathered her shawl and stood, balancing carefully on the rock. "Though she doesn't take kindly to boots on her clean floors, so you might want to knock off some of that trail dust before you arrive." As she stepped from the rock to shore, her foot slipped on the wet surface. Ethan moved quickly, closing the distance between them and catching her arm before she fell into the water. For a moment, they stood close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender in her hair. "Obliged," she said softly, steadying herself and gently pulling away. "Just returning the favor." Your singing gave this weary traveler a moment of peace. He placed his hat back on his head. "Maybe I'll hear it again sometime." He picked up a basket he hadn't noticed before, filled with what looked like freshly laundered linens. "Knight's Ferry is a small town, Mr. Cole. If you're staying, I imagine our paths will cross again." As she walked away toward town, Ethan found himself watching her until she disappeared around the bend. He returned to his horse, suddenly feeling an unexpected lightness in his step. "Come on, boy," he said to the gelding. "Looks like we might stay in Knight's Ferry a while." The boarding house was exactly where Bea had described, a 2-story clapboard building with a freshly painted sign. After securing a room from the stern-faced Mrs. Holloway, who indeed cast a disapproving glance at his dusty boots, Ethan made his way to the town's only saloon to inquire about work. The Railroad Exchange Saloon was busy for a weeknight, filled with the sounds of tinny piano music, raucous laughter, and the clink of glasses. Ethan ordered a whiskey and asked the barkeep about the cattle operation he'd heard was hiring. "That'd be the Vaughn Ranch," the barkeep said, wiping down the bar. Old Man Vaughn's been looking for experienced hands since he lost 2 good men last month. Ranch is about 3 miles north of town. Vaughn, Ethan repeated, the name instantly catching his attention. Any relation to a Miss Beatrice Vaughn? The barkeep chuckled. That'd be his daughter. You've met RB already, have you? Briefly, Ethan admitted. By the creek. Singing, was she? At Ethan's nod, the barkeep smiled. She's got a voice that'd make the angels jealous. Shame she only shares it with the river these days. Why's that? Ethan couldn't help but ask. Her mother was a singer. Came out west with a traveling show, met old Vaughn, and decided to stay. Taught B everything she knew before the consumption took her 3 years back. The barkeep lowered his voice. B hasn't sung in public since the funeral. Folks say she only sings by the river now, where her mother's ashes were scattered. Ethan felt a pang of something guilt for having intruded on what was clearly a private moment, mixed with a deeper appreciation for the beauty he'd witnessed. If you're looking for work at the Vaughn spread, you'd best talk to Thomas Vaughn himself, the barkeep continued. He'll be in town tomorrow for supplies. Usually stops in here around noon. I appreciate the information, Ethan said, finishing his drink. That night, as he lay in the narrow bed at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, the sound of B.A.'s voice echoed in his memory. For a man who had drifted with the seasons for most of his adult life, the sudden urge to stay put was unsettling. Yet as sleep finally claimed him, it was the image of sunlight on honey-brown hair and the melody of a river song that followed him into his dreams. Morning brought the bustle of a small town coming to life. Ethan spent the early hours tending to his horse and repairing a tear in his saddle before making his way back to the saloon shortly before noon. He'd barely settled at a corner table when a burly man with a salt and pepper beard and weathered face entered. From the respectful nods he received, Ethan guessed this was Thomas Vaughn. The rancher ordered a drink and took a seat at the bar, exchanging greetings with several patrons. Ethan waited until the man had finished his first drink before approaching. Mr. Vaughn? My name's Ethan Cole. I heard you might be looking for hands at your ranch. Vaughn looked him over with a critical eye. You've cowboyed before? Yes, sir. Started as a boy in Texas, worked spreads in Colorado, Montana, and Nebraska territories. I can break horses, mend fences, and work cattle with the best of them. What brings you to Wyoming? Vaughn asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Looking for steady work. I'm tired of drifting, Ethan answered honestly. Vaughn nodded slowly. My foreman quit drinking 3 months ago. Started reading the Bible instead. Now he won't hire anyone without asking about their character. A smile cracked through his stern expression. So tell me, Cole, are you honest? I've never stolen from an employer, sir. You fight. Only when necessary. Drink. Not to excess. Vaughn seemed satisfied. I pay $30 a month plus room and board. Season's winding down, but I've got a herd to move before winter and not enough men to do it. You can start tomorrow if you're interested. I am, Ethan said, extending his hand. As they shook, the saloon doors swung open, and B walked in. She was dressed more formally than the day before, in a simple blue dress with her hair pinned up beneath a modest hat. Conversation in the saloon quieted momentarily as several men nodded respectfully in her direction. Papa, she called, making her way to her father's side. Mrs. Holloway said you were here. The supply wagon's loaded, but Mr. Jenkins says he needs payment before. She stopped short upon seeing Ethan. B, this is Ethan Cole. Just hired him on. Vaughn looked between them curiously. You two acquainted? We met briefly yesterday, B said, her composure quickly returning. By the river. Something in her tone made Ethan wonder if she was asking him to keep her singing private. He nodded slightly. Miss Vaughn was kind enough to direct me to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. Well, you won't be needing that anymore, Vaughn said. You can bunk at the ranch. Tell Jenkins I'll be right over with the money. He turned back to Ethan. Can you ride out today? My foreman, Samuel, can get you settled. Yes, sir. I'll gather my things and be ready within the hour. As Vaughn left to settle his bill with the shopkeeper, Ethan found himself alone with Bea for a moment. So, you'll be working for my father, she said, her voice carefully neutral. It seems that way. The ranch hands usually keep to themselves, she said, not quite meeting his eyes. The river where we met. It's a private place for me. Ethan understood immediately. I haven't mentioned your singing to anyone, Miss Vaughn. And I won't. Relief softened her features. Thank you, Mr. Cole. May I ask why you keep such a gift hidden? A shadow crossed her face. Some gifts are too painful to share. Before he could respond, she added, I should join my father. The wagon's waiting. As she turned to leave, Ethan called after her. I meant what I said yesterday. It was beautiful. Bea paused, looking back at him with an unreadable expression. Welcome to Knight's Ferry, Mr. Cole. And then she was gone, leaving Ethan with the distinct feeling that he'd just stepped into something far more complicated than a ranch job. The Vaughn Ranch sprawled across several hundred acres of prime Wyoming grassland, with a sturdy main house, bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings arranged in a rough semicircle. Cattle dotted the nearby pastures, and a mountain range provided a dramatic backdrop to the west. Samuel Wright, the foreman Vaughn had mentioned, was a tall, lean man with a Bible tucked into his vest pocket and a no-nonsense demeanor. He showed Ethan to the bunkhouse where 5 other ranch hands were already settled, assigned him duties, and gave him a tour of the property. Mr. Vaughn runs a tight operation, Samuel explained as they walked. 200 head of cattle, 30 horses. We lost 2 men to a stampede back in August. Good men. Been short-handed since. Sorry to hear that, Ethan said. The Lord takes and the Lord gives, Samuel replied solemnly. You'll work sunup to sundown most days. Sundays we rest except for essential chores. Miss Beatrice usually plays the piano after Sunday supper, and all hands are welcome to listen in the main house. This piece of information caught Ethan's attention. She plays piano as well? Like an angel, Samuel said, with unusual warmth in his voice. Mrs. Vaughn, God rest her soul, made sure both her daughters had proper musical education. The younger one, Clara, married a banker in Cheyenne last year, but Bea stayed on to help her father run things. She helps run the ranch? Ethan asked, surprised. Samuel nodded. Don't let those delicate looks fool you. Miss Beatrice can ride as well as any man here, keeps the books, and still manages the household. Mr. Vaughn relies on her something fierce since his wife passed. As they approached the corral, Ethan spotted Bea herself, now changed into a split riding skirt, demonstrating something to a young stable boy. She sat atop a spirited chestnut mare with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. That's her training horse, Ember, Samuel explained, following Ethan's gaze. Hand raised that mare from a foal. Won't let anyone else ride her. Ethan watched as Bea guided the horse through a series of precise movements, her face alight with concentration. This was a different woman from the one he'd met by the river or seen in the saloon here. She was in her element, confident and commanding. As if sensing his attention, Bea glanced their way. She nodded briefly in acknowledgement before turning her attention back to the stable boy's lesson. You'll meet the rest of the hands at supper, Samuel said, leading Ethan toward the barn. Best get you started on your duties. We've got fences need mending in the north pasture. The next few days passed in a blur of physical labor. Ethan worked alongside the other ranch hands, repairing fences, moving cattle, and breaking a particularly stubborn colt. The men were a mixed lot: two brothers from Tennessee, an older cowboy who rarely spoke, a former soldier, and a Mexican vaquero who'd been with the Vaughn family for over a decade. They were wary of newcomers but seemed to accept Ethan's presence without much fuss. He caught only glimpses of Bea riding out at dawn to check the herd, carrying supplies between buildings, or occasionally visible through the main house windows as she went about her duties. Each time, he found his eyes drawn to her, curious about the woman who sang like an angel by the river but kept her voice hidden from the world. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a merciful break from the relentless work schedule. After morning chores, the hands cleaned up and gathered in the main house's spacious parlor for the promised musical entertainment. The room was comfortable but not ostentatious, with a piano positioned near large windows that looked out toward the mountains. Vaughn sat in a leather armchair, pipe in hand, while the ranch hands found seats on chairs and benches arranged for the occasion. Samuel, now dressed in his Sunday best, handed out him books. Bea entered wearing a simple but elegant dress of deep green that accentuated her eyes. Her hair was down, falling in waves past her shoulders. She smiled politely at the assembled group but didn't quite meet Ethan's gaze as she took her seat at the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, and Ethan found himself holding his breath. Then she began to play not a hymn as he'd expected, but a delicate, melodic piece that filled the room with warmth. Her technique was flawless, but it was the emotion behind the music that captivated him. This wasn't performance. It was conversation, the piano an extension of herself. When she finished, there was a moment of reverent silence before the room erupted in appreciative applause. Bea acknowledged the response with a modest nod, then turned to a selection of hymns that the men sang with varying degrees of musical ability. Ethan joined in where he could, but mostly he watched Bea. The tension that seemed to follow her during the week had melted away, replaced by a serene focus on the music. Yet he couldn't help noticing that not once did she sing along, even when the melodies clearly fell within her range. After an hour, the informal concert concluded. As the men filed out to enjoy their free afternoon, Ethan lingered, drawn to the piano. "You play beautifully," he said when they were nearly alone, Thomas Vaughn having stepped out to smoke his pipe on the porch. "Thank you," Bea replied, carefully arranging the sheet music. "My mother insisted on lessons from the time I could reach the keys. But you didn't sing with the hymns." Her hands stilled. "Mr. Cole, Ethan, please." She met his eyes then. "Ethan, I appreciate your kind words about my playing, but I would prefer if we didn't discuss my singing." "I apologize," he said sincerely. "I didn't mean to pry." Bea's expression softened slightly. "No, I'm sorry. You've been nothing but respectful." She hesitated, then added, "It's just complicated." "Life often is," Ethan agreed. After a pause, he ventured, "I heard about your mother. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." He closed the piano lid gently. "It's been 3 years, but some days it feels like yesterday." "I lost my father when I was 16, Ethan offered. "Shot during a bank robbery in Texas. Some wounds never fully heal." He studied him with new interest. "Is that why you started drifting?" "Partly," Ethan admitted. "My mother remarried a year later, a good man, but I was too angry to see it then. Thought I needed to make my own way. And now you're here in Knight's Ferry." It wasn't quite a question. "Now I'm here," he agreed. Sometimes a man gets tired of having nowhere to belong. Something in his words seemed to resonate with her. Bea opened her mouth as if to respond, but the moment was interrupted by her father's return. "Bea, the Hendersons have invited us for dinner," Thomas Vaughn announced. "You'd best get ready." "Yes, Papa." She rose gracefully, nodding to Ethan. "Enjoy your Sunday, Mr. Cole." As she left the room, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they'd been on the verge of a real conversation, something beyond pleasantries and careful distance. But like her song at the river, the moment had ended too soon. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Ethan proved his worth among the ranch hands, earning the respect of both Samuel and Thomas Vaughn with his hard work and skill with horses. September gave way to October, bringing cooler temperatures and the knowledge that winter wasn't far behind. Preparations began for the cattle drive that would take a portion of the herd to market before the first snows. Maps were studied, supplies gathered, and the best route debated in the evenings as the men smoked and played cards in the bunkhouse. One evening, as Ethan was grooming his horse after a long day of work, he became aware of someone entering the stable behind him. Turning, he found Bea watching him, a lantern in her hand casting golden light across her features. "Miss Vaughn," he said, surprised. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," she assured him. "I just wanted to inform you personally that Papa has decided you'll be joining the drive to Cheyenne." "I'd hoped I would," Ethan replied. "I appreciate the opportunity." Bea stepped closer, setting her lantern on a nearby post. "Samuel speaks highly of your abilities. Says you have a way with the more difficult horses." "I've always found that understanding comes before control," Ethan said, returning to brushing his gelding. "Horses are honest creatures. They respond to patience and consistency." "Is that why you've been so patient with me?" Bea asked suddenly. Ethan's hand stilled. "I'm not sure I follow. You've been here nearly a month, Mr. Cole. You've been unfailingly polite, respectful of my boundaries, and yet—" She took a breath. "I see how you look at me sometimes. When you think I don't notice." Heat rose in Ethan's face. "I meant no disrespect, Miss Vaughn. I didn't say I found it disrespectful," she replied quietly. Their eyes met in the lantern light, and Ethan felt the shift between them, a door opening ever so slightly. "The truth is," he said carefully, "I haven't been able to forget your voice since that day by the river. It stirred something in me I thought was long buried." Bea looked away. "You're leaving on the cattle drive soon. For 2 weeks at most. Many men say they'll return, only to find the open trail more appealing than keeping their word." "I'm not many men," Ethan said simply. Bea studied him for a long moment. "No," she finally agreed. "I don't believe you are." She picked up her lantern. "Will you walk with me tomorrow? After your duties are done? There's a place I'd like to show you." "I'd be honored," Ethan replied, surprised by the invitation. "Meet me by the large cottonwood behind the house, just before sunset." She turned to leave, then paused. "And Ethan? This remains between us." After she'd gone, Ethan found himself staring at the space where she'd stood, wondering what had prompted her change of heart and what place she could possibly want to show him. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Ethan threw himself into his tasks with extra vigor, trying to distract himself from thoughts of the evening to come. By the time he'd finished his duties, cleaned up, and changed into his least worn shirt, the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountain peaks. He arrived at the designated meeting spot to find Bea already waiting. She wore a simple riding skirt and jacket, her hair partially tied back with a ribbon. "You came," she said, sounding almost surprised. "Did you doubt I would?" A small smile played at her lips. "Not entirely." She gestured toward 2 horses tethered nearby, her chestnut mare and a bay gelding from the ranch's string. "I hope you don't mind riding. It's a short journey, but faster on horseback." They mounted up and set off away from the ranch, following a narrow trail that wound through a stand of aspen trees now turned golden with autumn. Bea rode confidently ahead, occasionally glancing back to ensure Ethan was following. They didn't speak much, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. After about 20 minutes, the trail opened onto a small, secluded meadow nestled against the foothills. A clear stream cut through its center, the same river that ran past Knight's Ferry. But here it was smaller, more intimate. Wildflowers still bloomed despite the season, and the setting sun painted everything in warm amber light. "It's beautiful," Ethan said as they dismounted. "This was my mother's favorite place," Bea explained, leading her horse to a grassy patch where it could graze. "She used to bring us here for picnics when Clara and I were young. Later, when she became ill, Papa would bring her just to sit and watch the sunset." Ethan sensed the significance of being shown this place. "Thank you for sharing it with me." Bea nodded, then walked to the edge of the stream. "After she died, I couldn't bear to sing anymore. It had been our special connection. She taught me everything I knew, encouraged me when others thought it improper for a rancher's daughter to love music so deeply." She looked up at the darkening sky. "But I found I could still sing here and by the river in town. Somehow, it felt like she could still hear me in those places." "The barkeep told me your mother came west with a traveling show," Ethan said gently. "She did. She had dreams of performing in grand concert halls back east, but life had other plans." Bea turned to face him. "When I saw you watching me that day by the river, I was terrified. That private part of myself suddenly had a witness. I never meant to intrude. I know that now." She took a step closer to him. "What I couldn't understand was why I kept thinking about you afterward. Why, despite my embarrassment, I felt something wake up inside me." Ethan's heart quickened. "Bea, let me finish, please," she said softly. "I've spent 3 years focused only on helping Papa, on keeping the ranch running, on being the daughter he needed. I locked away the parts of me that reminded me too much of her, the singing, the dreams I once had." She took a shaky breath. "But then you heard me sing, and you looked at me as if you'd found something precious. Not with pity or judgment, but with genuine appreciation." "Because I had," Ethan said simply. Bea's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I brought you here because this is the only place I've ever felt truly myself since she died. And I needed to know if what I've been feeling is real." Ethan stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her blue eyes. "And what have you been feeling, Bea Vaughn? Like perhaps there's room in life for more than duty and memory. Like perhaps there's room for hope." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Am I foolish to think that?" "No," Ethan said firmly. "You're not foolish at all." He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to step away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. When she didn't pull back, he let his hand linger, cradling her cheek. "Since that day by the river," he admitted, "I haven't been able to think of much else but you. Your voice, yes, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard, but also your strength, your devotion to your family, the way you command respect without demanding it." Bea leaned almost imperceptibly into his touch. "The cattle drive leaves in 2 days. And I will come back," Ethan promised. "If you want me to." "I do," she whispered. "I want to see where this might lead." The last light of sunset caught in her hair as Ethan leaned down, hesitating just a breath away from her lips. Bea closed the final distance between them, her kiss tentative at first, then blooming with quiet certainty. When they finally parted, the first stars had appeared in the darkening sky. Bea looked up at him with wonder, as if seeing him truly seeing him for the first time. "Will you sing for me?" Ethan asked softly. "Here, where it's just us and the memory of your mother?" Bea hesitated, then nodded. She moved a few steps away, gathering herself, then closed her eyes and began to sing. The melody was different from the one he'd heard by the river, this one more hopeful, rising and falling like the stream beside them. Her voice filled the small meadow, bouncing off the hillside and seeming to make the very stars shine brighter. Ethan stood transfixed, understanding in that moment that whatever path his life had taken, all the wandering, all the searching had led him precisely where he needed to be. To this woman, this voice, this feeling of coming home at last. When the final notes faded into the night air, Bea opened her eyes to find Ethan watching her with undisguised adoration. "Thank you," he said simply. She smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed her face. "We should head back before they send out a search party." As they rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, side by side now rather than one following the other, Ethan found himself planning his return from the cattle drive not just to Knight's Ferry or the Vaughn Ranch, but to Bea and the promise of something he'd never dared hope for: belonging. The morning of the cattle drive dawned crisp and clear. 2,000 head of cattle would be driven to the railhead in Cheyenne, a journey that would take approximately 2 weeks if weather conditions remained favorable. Thomas Vaughn had selected his most experienced hands for the drive, including Ethan, who found himself both eager for the challenge and reluctant to leave. Bea was already up when the men gathered in the pre-dawn darkness, distributing coffee and final provisions. She moved efficiently among them, her manner professional, but when she handed Ethan his supplies, their fingers brushed deliberately. "Safe journey," she said, her voice steady though her eyes conveyed more than her words. "I'll return as soon as we're done," Ethan promised quietly. Thomas Vaughn approached, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. "Cole, you'll be riding flank with Miguel. Keep those steers moving, but don't push them too hard the first few days." "Yes, sir," Ethan replied, tearing his gaze away from Bea. As the men mounted up and the cattle began their slow procession eastward, Ethan looked back one last time. Bea stood on the porch of the main house, a solitary figure against the pale dawn light. She raised her hand in farewell, and Ethan tipped his hat before turning to face the long journey ahead. The cattle drive was grueling work, filled with long days in the saddle, short nights of fitful sleep, and the constant vigilance required to keep 2,000 head of cattle moving in roughly the same direction. Yet Ethan found himself thriving on the challenge, earning grudging respect from even the most experienced drovers. At night, as the men gathered around campfires to eat their simple meals and share stories, Ethan's thoughts inevitably drifted back to the Vaughn Ranch and to Bea. He'd been a drifter for so long that the intensity of his feelings surprised him. In just 1 month, she had become the center of a world he was only beginning to imagine for himself. "You're mighty quiet tonight, Cole," observed Franklin, one of the Tennessee brothers, as they sat by the fire on their 10th night out. "Just thinking," Ethan replied. The older cowboy, Jensen, chuckled knowingly. "He's thinking about Miss Beatrice, that's what." Ethan's head snapped up. "What makes you say that?" Miguel, who rarely joined in the men's banter, smiled faintly. "It is obvious, amigo. The way you look at her when you think no one sees." Franklin nodded. "And the way she started looking back. I mean, no disrespect," Ethan said carefully. "None taken," Franklin assured him. "Miss B is a fine woman, smart, capable, pretty as a sunrise. Can't blame a man for noticing." Jensen poked at the fire with a stick. "Her daddy's protective, though. Ran off the last fellow who came sniffing around, that banker from Laramie, who thought he could charm her with fancy words and city manners." "I'm not looking to charm anyone," Ethan said honestly. He trailed off, unsure how to express what he felt without sounding like a lovesick fool. "You're different," Miguel said simply. "She sees it. We see it." He shrugged. "Time will tell." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Ethan was left pondering Miguel's words. He was different from the restless young man who'd left Texas, from the drifter who never stayed in one place long enough to form attachments. Bea had changed something in him, awakened a longing for roots, for connection, for a future that included more than just the next job or the next town. The cattle drive reached Cheyenne without major incident. After delivering the herd to the buyers and receiving payment on behalf of Thomas Vaughn, the men had a night in town before beginning the return journey. Most headed straight for the saloons, eager for whiskey and female company after 2 weeks on the trail. Ethan joined them for one drink but declined invitations to visit the town's brothel. Instead, he found himself in a small shop that sold ladies' accessories, drawn by a display in the window. Inside, he carefully selected a silver hair comb with a pattern of leaves and small blue stones that reminded him of Bea's eyes. It was an extravagance on a cowboy's wages, but as he handed over the money, he knew it was worth every cent. The return to the ranch was faster without cattle to herd, and the men rode with the eager energy of those heading home. As they crested the final hill and the Vaughn spread came into view, Ethan felt a surge of anticipation that had nothing to do with the hot meal and soft bed awaiting them. Thomas Vaughn greeted the returning men with hearty handshakes and news that the payment for the cattle had already been wired to the bank in Knight's Ferry. "Good work, boys," he said, his gruff voice tinged with genuine appreciation. "Take tomorrow to rest up, then it's back to regular duties." Ethan scanned the yard for Bea but didn't see her. As the men dispersed to the bunkhouse, Samuel approached him. "Miss Beatrice asked me to tell you she's at the river," the foreman said quietly. "Said you'd understand." Ethan nodded his thanks, quickly stabling his horse and washing off the worst of the trail dust before heading toward the creek that ran along the edge of the Vaughn property. He found her in their spot, the place she'd shown him before he left. She sat by the water, her back to him, seemingly lost in thought. The late afternoon sun gilded her hair and silhouetted her slender figure against the backdrop of golden aspen trees. "Bea!" he called softly. She turned, rising to her feet in one fluid motion. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other across the distance. Then Bea was moving toward him, and Ethan found himself meeting her halfway. She stopped just short of embracing him, her eyes searching his face. "You're back," she said, as if needing to confirm the evidence before her. "I told you I would be," Ethan replied, drinking in the sight of her. "The drive went well? Everyone returned safely? Without incident? Your father seemed pleased." Bea nodded, a smile finally breaking through her composed expression. "I'm glad." "I missed you," Ethan said simply. "And I you," she admitted. "More than I expected to." Ethan reached into his pocket, suddenly nervous. "I brought you something from Cheyenne. It's not much, but—" "You didn't need to bring me anything," Bea protested. "I wanted to." He held out the small package wrapped in brown paper. "Please." Bea accepted it with careful hands, unwrapping the paper to reveal the silver comb. Her breath caught audibly. "Ethan, it's beautiful. The blue stones reminded me of your eyes," he explained. "And I thought, well, it seemed like something you might wear when you play piano on Sundays." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with emotion. "No one has given me a gift like this since my mother died. I'll treasure it." "May I?" Ethan asked, gesturing to the comb. When Bea nodded, he gently took it from her hands and stepped behind her. With careful movements, he gathered a portion of her hair and secured it with the comb, his fingers brushing against her neck. Bea turned to face him once more, and this time there was no hesitation. She stepped into his embrace as naturally as if they'd done this 100 times before. Ethan's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as their lips met in a kiss that spoke of absence endured and reunion celebrated. When they finally parted, Bea rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Now?" Ethan said, stroking her hair. "I speak to your father." Bea pulled back slightly to look up at him. "About what, exactly?" "About my intentions," Ethan replied seriously. "About wanting to court you properly with his blessing." "And what are your intentions, Ethan Cole?" There was a hint of teasing in her voice, but her eyes were serious. "To love you," he answered honestly. "To build a life with you if you'll have me. I can't offer much yet, I'm still just a hired hand, but I'm willing to work harder than any man alive to be worthy of you." B.A.'s hand came up to cup his cheek. "You already are." As the sun began to set over the Wyoming landscape, casting long shadows across the meadow, they walked hand in hand back toward the ranch, each step bringing them closer to a future neither had imagined just 1 month before, a future that had begun with a song by a river and a cowboy who had finally found what had been missing from his life. The conversation with Thomas Vaughn came sooner than Ethan had planned. The very next evening, as he finished his chores in the barn, the rancher approached him with purposeful strides. "Cole," Vaughn said without preamble, "walk with me." They moved away from the main buildings in silence, Vaughn leading them toward a rise that overlooked the property. When they reached the top, he stopped and turned to face Ethan directly. "Samuel tells me you and my daughter have grown close." Ethan met the older man's gaze steadily. "Yes, sir. I was planning to speak with you about it." "Were you now?" Vaughn's expression was unreadable in the fading light. "And what exactly were you planning to say?" "That I have feelings for Beatrice. Genuine feelings that go beyond admiration or attraction." Ethan took a deep breath. "I'd like your permission to court her properly." Vaughn studied him for a long moment. "You've been here, what, 6 weeks? That's not a lot of time to know your own mind, let alone someone else's." "With all due respect, sir, sometimes you just know." Ethan held the rancher's gaze. "I've never felt for anyone what I feel for your daughter." "And what about your drifting ways?" Vaughn challenged. "B told me about your background. What guarantee do I have that you won't get restless come spring and move on, leaving her heartbroken?" It was a fair question, one that Ethan had asked himself repeatedly. "No man can see the future, Mr. Vaughn. But I can tell you this, I'm tired of having nowhere to belong. For the first time in my life, I found a place and a person that make me want to stay put. I can't offer guarantees, but I can offer my word that I will do everything in my power to make me happy." Vaughn turned to look out over his land, now bathed in the purple light of dusk. "My wife was a city girl," he said unexpectedly, "full of dreams and music and ideas that had no place on a cattle ranch in Wyoming. Everyone said she'd never last out here." A smile softened his weathered features. "They were wrong. She adapted, built a life, raised 2 fine daughters. But she never lost that spark that made her special." He looked back at Ethan. "B is like her in many ways, stronger than she looks, with depths most folks never see. Since her mother died, something in her has been dormant, until recently." "Sir," Ethan prompted when Vaughn fell silent. "She's been singing again," the rancher said simply. "Not just by the river, but in the house when she thinks no one's listening. I haven't heard her sing in 3 years, Cole. Not since we scattered her mother's ashes." Ethan felt a surge of emotion too complex to name. "I'm glad to hear that. Are you responsible?" Vaughn asked directly. "I don't know," Ethan answered honestly. "I hope I've played some small part in bringing her joy, but the strength and the music have always been inside her." Vaughn nodded slowly. "Good answer." He turned to face Ethan fully. "Here's my position, Cole. You've proven yourself a hard worker and an honest man. I've no objection to you courting my daughter, provided you understand 2 things. First, her happiness is paramount to me. If you hurt her, there won't be a place in Wyoming or beyond where you can hide from me." "Understood," Ethan said solemnly. "Second," Vaughn continued, "if things progress between you 2, I expect you to put down real roots here. That means no more drifting, no more restlessness. It means committing not just to B but to this land, this life. That's what I want." Ethan assured him. A chance to build something lasting. Vaughn extended his hand. Then you have my blessing. But remember what I said. As they shook hands, Ethan knew he'd just made the most significant commitment of his life, not just to court Bea, but to become the kind of man who could offer her stability, security, and a future tied to the land her family had cultivated for generations. Winter arrived in Wyoming with a vengeance, blanketing the ranch in snow and confining much of life to indoor activities. For Ethan, who'd spent most winters in warmer territories, the adjustment was significant but not unwelcome. The cold months brought a different rhythm to ranch work, maintenance of buildings and equipment, care for the animals in the barns, and long evenings by the fire. They also brought opportunities to spend time with Bea that the busy seasons wouldn't have allowed. With her father's blessing, their courtship progressed naturally. Ethan joined the Vaughns for dinner several times a week, and on Sundays after her piano playing, they would often sit together in the parlor, talking until the fire burned low. Bea began to share more of herself, her childhood memories, her brief time at a finishing school in Denver, which she'd hated, her dreams of perhaps one day opening a small music school in Knights Ferry for local children. In turn, Ethan told her about his years on the trail, the sights he'd seen, and the growing emptiness that had driven him to seek something more permanent. "Did you ever consider returning to Texas?" Bea asked one snowy evening as they sat in the parlor, a quilt spread across their laps. Her father had discreetly retired early, leaving them alone with the unspoken understanding that propriety would be maintained. "Once or twice," Ethan admitted. "But my mother passed 5 years ago, and my stepfather moved back east to live with his daughter from his first marriage. There wasn't much to return to." "So you truly have no family?" Bea asked softly. "Not by blood," Ethan replied. "But I'm starting to believe family is something you can build as well as be born into." Bea's hand found his beneath the quilt. "I'd like to hear you play something," Ethan said, nodding toward the piano. "Whatever you'd like." Bea hesitated only briefly before rising and moving to the instrument. She adjusted the silver comb in her hair. She wore it often now and sat with perfect posture, her fingers hovering over the keys for a moment of centering. The piece she chose was unfamiliar to Ethan, something classical and complex that demonstrated her considerable skill. But what captivated him was what happened next as the final notes faded. Bea seamlessly transitioned into a simpler melody, and then, to his astonishment, she began to sing. Her voice filled the parlor with a clarity and emotion that made his chest ache. The song was a folk ballad about enduring love, and she sang it directly to him, her eyes never leaving his face. It was the first time she had sung for him indoors, the first time she had shared this gift in the context of her home rather than by the river. When she finished, Ethan found himself momentarily speechless. "Bea," he finally managed. "That was—" She rose from the piano bench and returned to his side. "I've been practicing," she said simply. "When no one was around at first, but lately." She took his hand. "I realized that hiding my voice was like hiding part of myself. And I don't want to hide from you, Ethan." He brought her hand to his lips. "I fall more in love with you every day." It was the first time either of them had used that word, and it hung in the air between them, momentous and true. "And I with you?" Bea whispered, leaning in to press a soft kiss to his lips. As winter deepened, their connection grew stronger. Ethan found unexpected pleasure in the traditions of the season, helping to cut a Christmas tree for the main house, joining in the celebration when Clara and her husband visited from Cheyenne, exchanging simple gifts on Christmas morning. For Bea, he'd carved a small wooden box to hold her jewelry, including the silver comb. The intricate pattern of wildflowers he'd etched into the lid had taken weeks of evening work, but her delight made every hour worthwhile. Her gift to him was equally thoughtful, a handsome leather-bound journal with his initials stamped on the cover. "For all the stories you tell me about your travels," she explained. "I thought you might want to write them down someday." By the time spring began to thaw the frozen landscape, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Beatrice Vaughn. The question was no longer if but how and when to ask her to be his wife. The opportunity came on a mild day in early April. The snow had receded enough to make the trail to their special place by the river passable, and Ethan suggested they ride out to see if the first wildflowers had begun to appear. The meadow was still recovering from winter's grip, but signs of renewal were everywhere: tender green shoots pushing through the soil, buds forming on the aspen trees, the river running full and vibrant with snowmelt. They walked hand in hand along the bank, reacquainting themselves with a place that had become sacred to them both. "I've been thinking," Ethan said as they settled on a flat rock overlooking the water. "That sounds dangerous," Bea teased, leaning against his shoulder. "Very funny." He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the lavender scent of her hair. "I've been talking with your father about my position at the ranch." Bea looked up at him. "What about it?" "We've agreed that I'll take on more responsibility, essentially becoming second foreman, with an eye toward eventually taking over for Samuel when he retires." "That's wonderful news," Bea said, genuine pleasure in her voice. "There's more," Ethan continued. "With the additional pay, I've been able to set some money aside. Your father has offered to sell me a small parcel of land, the area near the eastern ridge with that view you love so much." Bea's eyes widened. "For what purpose?" This was the moment. Ethan took both her hands in his and turned to face her directly. "To build a home, Bea. Our home, if you'll have me." Understanding dawned in her eyes, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. Ethan reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a ring with a modest sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. It had cost him nearly all his savings, purchased during a supply run to Cheyenne when Bea thought he was helping Miguel with the spring horses. "Beatrice Vaughn," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "From the moment I heard you singing by the river, you filled an emptiness in my life I didn't even know was there. You've given me a home, a purpose, a future worth working toward. I love you more than I ever thought possible, and I want to spend every day of the rest of my life showing you just how much." He held up the ring. "Will you marry me?" Tears filled Bea's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Ethan Cole, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Bea threw her arms around his neck, kissing him with a passion that spoke of promises fulfilled and dreams coming true. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I should warn you," he said playfully. "I expect singing in our home. Lots of it." "I think that can be arranged," Bea replied, her eyes shining. "After all, it's what brought you to me in the first place." In that perfect moment, with the woman he loved in his arms and the Wyoming landscape stretching endlessly around them, Ethan felt a sense of belonging more profound than anything he'd ever known. His days of drifting were over. He had found his home, his heart, his future, all because he'd heard a woman singing by a river and recognized what had been missing from his life. The wedding took place in late June, when the meadows were alive with wildflowers and the days stretched long and golden. Rather than the church in Knight's Ferry, Bea had suggested they hold the ceremony in the special meadow by the river, a place that held such significance for both of them. Thomas Vaughn, though initially skeptical, had eventually agreed when he saw how much it meant to his daughter. Guests arrived on horseback and in wagons, the entire ranch staff and their families, friends from town, Clara and her husband from Cheyenne, and even a few of Ethan's former trail companions who'd received word of the celebration. A local minister officiated, standing beneath an arch of wildflowers and aspen branches that Miguel and the other hands had constructed. Ethan waited nervously at the front, dressed in a new suit that felt stiff and formal compared to his usual attire. But when the small gathering fell silent and he turned to see Bea approaching on her father's arm, every other thought vanished from his mind. She wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her slender frame, with wildflowers woven into her honey-brown hair alongside the silver comb he'd given her. The afternoon sunlight seemed to follow her, casting her in a glow that made her appear almost ethereal. Yet her steps were firm on the earth, her smile certain as her eyes found his across the distance. Thomas Vaughn placed his daughter's hand in Ethan's with a mixture of pride and wistfulness. "Take care of my girl," he said simply. "With everything I am," Ethan promised. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices carrying clearly in the open air, birds occasionally adding their songs to the proceedings as if in blessing. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed his bride to the cheers and applause of everyone gathered, feeling a joy so complete it seemed almost impossible to contain. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. Tables had been set up beneath the trees, laden with food prepared by Mrs. Holloway and other women from town. Lanterns hung from branches, casting warm light as darkness fell. There was music, a fiddler and guitar player from Knight's Ferry providing lively tunes for dancing. At one point, Clara approached the musicians with a conspiratorial smile. After a brief conversation, they nodded and fell silent. Clara turned to the gathering. "For those who don't know me, I'm Bea's sister," she announced. "And I have a special request for the bride." Bea looked momentarily confused until Clara continued. "My sister has the most beautiful voice in all of Wyoming territory, perhaps in all the West. But for too long, she kept that gift hidden away." Clara's expression softened. "Today seems like the perfect day to share it once more. Bea, will you sing for us? For your husband, for Papa, for all of us who love you." A hush fell over the gathering. Bea looked at Ethan, a question in her eyes. He squeezed her hand gently. "Only if you want to," he said softly. Bea rose to her feet, smoothing her wedding dress. She took a deep breath, looking around at the faces watching her with expectation and affection. Then, without accompaniment, she began to sing. The song was one her mother had taught her, about love that endures through all seasons and trials. Her voice rose clear and strong into the evening air, no longer confined to secret moments by the river but offered freely as the gift it was. Ethan watched his wife with undisguised adoration, while Thomas Vaughn wiped away unashamed tears. When the final note faded away, there was a moment of reverent silence before the gathering erupted in applause. Bea's cheeks flushed with pleasure as she returned to Ethan's side. "That," he whispered in her ear, "was the greatest wedding gift I could have asked for." Later, as the celebration continued around them, Ethan and Bea slipped away to stand by the river's edge. The water reflected the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and the sounds of music and laughter provided a gentle backdrop to their moment of privacy. "Happy, Mrs. Cole?" Ethan asked, his arms encircling her waist from behind. "More than I knew was possible," Bea replied, leaning back against his chest. "And you? I have everything I never knew to wish for," he said honestly. "A home, a future, and a wife who sings like an angel." Bea turned in his arms to face him. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day by the river in town? That my singing gave a weary traveler a moment of peace. I remember every word." She reached up to touch his face tenderly. "You're not a traveler anymore, Ethan. You're home." As he leaned down to kiss her beneath the Wyoming stars, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that she was right. His wandering days were over, replaced by something infinitely more precious, a life built on love, music, and the steady rhythm of days shared with the woman who had captured his heart with a song by the river. The years that followed were rich with both joy and challenge. True to their plan, Ethan and Bea built their home on the eastern ridge of the Vaughn property, a sturdy two-story structure with wide porches and large windows that framed the spectacular landscape. They worked side by side to make it truly theirs, Ethan crafting much of the furniture himself, Bea creating a warm and inviting interior that reflected both practicality and beauty. Ethan grew into his role as second foreman, earning the respect of the ranch hands through his fair leadership and willingness to work alongside them in even the most demanding tasks. When Samuel finally retired in 1878, Thomas Vaughn didn't hesitate to promote Ethan to head foreman, effectively making him second in command of the entire operation. Bea, meanwhile, never returned to hiding her musical gifts. She began giving piano lessons to children from Knight's Ferry and surrounding homesteads, her small music school growing steadily as her reputation spread. On special occasions, she would sing at town gatherings, her clear voice drawing people from miles around to hear her. Their first child, a son they named James Thomas Cole, arrived in the spring of 1877, bringing a new dimension of love and purpose to their lives. Ethan found himself transformed by fatherhood, discovering wells of patience and tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. Little Jamie had his mother's blue eyes and his father's determined spirit, toddling after Ethan from the moment he could walk, eager to help with ranch chores. Their daughter, Margaret Rose, followed 2 years later, a serious child with a sweet disposition who showed early signs of inheriting her mother's musical talent. By the age of 4, she could pick out simple tunes on the piano and sing with perfect pitch that astonished even Bea. Life settled into a rhythm marked by the changing seasons, the cycles of ranch work, and the steady growth of their children. There were difficult times, a harsh winter in 1880 that threatened the herd, a fever that nearly took young Jamie when he was 5, periods of drought that tested everyone's resilience. Yet through it all, Ethan and Bea faced each challenge together, their bond only strengthening with each obstacle overcome. Thomas Vaughn remained a steadfast presence in their lives, doting on his grandchildren and gradually entrusting more of the ranch's management to Ethan as age began to slow his own participation. He never remarried, content with his role as patriarch of the growing family and mentor to the man who had proven worthy of his daughter's hand. In the summer of 1883, nearly a decade after Ethan first heard Bea singing by the river, they celebrated their anniversary by returning to the meadow where they'd exchanged their vows. They brought a picnic and their children, now old enough to understand the significance of the place in their parents' story. As Jamie and Maggie played by the water's edge under Ethan's watchful eye, Bea spread a blanket beneath their favorite tree and unpacked the food she'd prepared. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked unexpectedly as they sat watching their children. "Miss what?" Ethan asked, though he suspected he knew what she meant. "The open trail, the freedom of not being tied to one place." Bea's expression was thoughtful rather than worried. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you'd continued drifting?" Ethan considered the question seriously, knowing she deserved an honest answer. "I sometimes think about the places I never saw," he admitted. "The mountains in California, the coast of the Pacific. But miss it." He shook his head firmly. "Not for a single day." He took her hand, the same hand that now wore both her engagement ring and the simple gold band he'd placed there on their wedding day. "What I had before wasn't freedom, Bea. It was emptiness disguised as freedom. What I found here with you, with our children, with this land is what true freedom feels like. The freedom to love, to build, to belong." Bea's eyes shimmered with emotion. "Even after all these years, you still have a way with words, Ethan Cole." "Only when they're true," he replied, leaning in to kiss her softly. "Mama, Papa, look what I found." Maggie's excited voice interrupted them as she ran toward the blanket, her small hands cupped carefully around some treasure. As they turned their attention to their daughter's discovery, a tiny, perfect bird's egg, blue as the Wyoming sky, Ethan felt the familiar surge of gratitude that had become the backdrop of his life. Here, in this meadow with the people he loved most in the world, was everything he had ever needed. That evening, after the children were tucked into bed back at their home, Ethan stood on the porch watching the stars emerge one by one. Bea joined him, slipping her hand into his with the easy familiarity of long partnership. "I've been thinking," she said, echoing the words he'd used to begin his proposal years before. "That sounds dangerous," he teased, repeating her response from that day. She laughed softly. "I've been considering expanding the music school. There's a building for sale in Knight's Ferry, the old mercantile that's been empty since the Jenkinses moved to Cheyenne. It would give us space for more students, maybe even bring in another teacher." "You've been planning this for a while," Ethan observed, knowing his wife well enough to recognize when she'd thought something through completely. "I have," she admitted. "The children are getting older, and while I love teaching here at home, I think it's time to create something more permanent, something that might outlast us." Ethan pulled her closer. "I think it's a wonderful idea. Your mother would be proud." "Do you think so?" Bea asked, vulnerability flashing briefly in her eyes. "I know so." He kissed her temple. "She gave you the gift of music, and now you're passing it on to a whole new generation. What could make a mother prouder than that?" They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the night deepen over the land they both loved. "Did I ever tell you," Ethan said eventually, "that the moment I heard you singing that day, I knew something fundamental had changed for me? It wasn't just that your voice was beautiful, though it was beyond words. It was that it seemed to reach inside me and touch something I'd forgotten was there." "What was that?" Bea asked softly. "Hope," he answered simply. "Hope that there might be more to life than just moving from place to place, job to job. Hope that I might find somewhere someone that felt like home." He turned to face her fully. "You gave me that gift, Bea. You and this place and the life we've built together." Bea's eyes glistened in the moonlight. "And you gave me the courage to sing again, to embrace all parts of myself, even the ones that reminded me of what I'd lost." She placed a hand over his heart. "We've given each other so much, and we have so much more to give," Ethan said, thinking of their children sleeping peacefully inside, of the expanded music school Bea envisioned, of all the years stretching before them. "This is just the beginning." As they stood together on the porch of the home they'd built, the Wyoming night wrapped around them like a familiar embrace. In the distance, the soft murmur of the river provided a gentle accompaniment to the symphony of their shared life, a life that had begun with a song, a chance encounter, and a cowboy who had finally found what had been missing from his heart.